There is a dangerous idea that has been driven into the public over the past century, and that has demonstrably and consciously been driven into the public's mind by certain connected individuals for certain reasons that we will get into shortly, that there is an ideal of journalistic objectivity to be reached, that somehow there is some ideal in which the conveying of news information can be done in some completely objective sense that has no agenda, ideology, or political persuasion behind it. And it is important to understand that that idea is itself a lie. It is completely and utterly unattainable. It is a myth. So first, let's talk a little bit about that, because I, obviously, as someone who has entered the alternative media and now has that perspective of producing media of my own, I now understand this from a personal experience that I don't think I ever would have if I had not been doing this myself. But it is self-evidently the fact and the case that every single time you see a news report on television or on the radio or anywhere else that you encounter that information, it is subjective. It is coming from a worldview. It is politically informed. It does have an entire ideology and an idea behind it that is being pushed by the very existence of that news story. And again, this is a fundamental point. It isn't about people being bought or paid off or corrupted or colluding. It is the nature of the way that we convey information. So that, for example, when you watch a news report on TV, whatever that report might be about, it is coming from an ideological viewpoint insofar as some editor somewhere along the line has decided that this story should be reported on and not another story. So the idea of news itself is an ideological construction that, for example, we sitting in our homes need to know about the intimate details of a political scandal happening in Italy or whatever. If we see that on the news, then that is obviously something that someone thinks we need to know about. That in and of itself comes from a certain political ideology. And when, for example, someone does a random act of kindness for another person, well, that's not news. We don't talk about that on the news. Again, everything comes from an ideological perspective. Everything is ideologically informed in that manner. So even deciding what to cover and what not to cover is in and of itself an example of how journalism is not and can never be objective. And of course, within the story itself, what is covered, who is talked to, who is not talked to, what viewpoints are not covered, again, is that type of background decision that the viewer never sees on the screen. They never see that decision process, but it is there behind every single story. So this idea that some objective journalist is going to come along and present the truth, so wholesale and 100% exactly as it exists in reality in some sort of edited news package, is not only an ideal, but it's a myth. It completely cannot exist. And this is reflected everywhere, not only in, as we've talked about, in what stories are covered or what aren't covered, or who is talked to and who is not talked to for comment on these different stories, but how about just the nature of the language itself in which this information is conveyed, choosing what language to use to describe a certain phenomenon or a certain group of people is in and of itself ideologically informed. Whether someone is a terrorist or a freedom fighter is something that will completely skew the reader or the listener or the viewer's perception of that story. And again, it's not the type of thing that's ever explicitly stated, but that language itself shapes our understanding of the news story and is ideologically and politically informed. So again, there is no escaping the subjectivity of having a worldview. I don't pretend that the Corbett Report is some objective ideal that exists in the world of objective reality. It is coming from my ideological framework and from my perspective. And every single other piece of media you ever see from anyone who has ever existed or will ever exist on the planet Earth similarly comes from such a perspective. And it is only when we start to forget or start to wish away that fact that we can be manipulated by that media. When we understand that something is coming from an ideological background, then we can at least take that into account when we are taking in that information. Now, let's step back for a moment and ask ourselves how and why and when this ideal of objective journalism even started in the first place. Because again, like so many other ideals that we have just taken as basic reality, it itself has been inculcated in us through a concerted system of indoctrination that has worked so well that we now forget there was ever a time when this was not something that was seen as an ideal to strive towards in journalism. So let's take a look at a very interesting article on this subject called Against Objective Journalism that was written by Kevin Carson and appeared on the c4ss.org website, the Center for a Stateless Society website. It was posted there back in October of 2012, although the article itself dates back from 2008. But reading from that article, Kevin Carson writes, quote, "The conventional model of objectivity in professional journalism, otherwise known as he said, she said, and stenography, as it's practiced today in the dead tree media, goes back to Walter Lippmann. As Christopher Lasch described it in The Revolt of the Elites, Lippmann's view of society and government in general was that substantive questions could be safely left to experts whose access to scientific knowledge immunized them against the emotional symbols and stereotypes that dominated public debate. His influence on 20th century journalism in particular was to destroy the earlier function of newspapers in the 19th century as the center of democratic debate. Newspapers might have served as extensions of the town meeting. Instead, they embraced a misguided ideal of objectivity and defined their goal as the circulation of reliable information. Lasch believed that the ideal of objectivity was wrong-headed because it ignored the dialectical nature of truth. What democracy requires is vigorous public debate, not information. Of course, it needs information too, but the kind of information it needs can be generated only by debate. We do not know what we need to know until we ask the right questions, and we can identify the right questions only by subjecting our own ideas about the world to the test of public controversy. Information, usually seen as the precondition of debate, is better understood as its byproduct. When we get into arguments that focus and fully engage our attention, we become avid seekers of relevant information. Otherwise, we take in information passively, if we take it in at all." End quote. Well, that's an absolutely important piece of this puzzle, and I will direct people to that article so you can go and read it in its entirety, talking there about the idea of Lippmann and how he introduced this ideal of objectivity into the journalistic profession that did not necessarily exist before that point. And I hope people will not get hung up on words like democracy, etc. in that article. Obviously, that's not the point of the article. The point is that the idea of objectivity is itself a complete myth, a fabrication, something that has been put in there specifically so that we can take the debate out of this realm of journalism so that people will only ever see the one side that is presented in the way that it is presented by the people who are controlling and editing that media. The ideal of journalistic objectivity is itself completely unattainable. It is a myth. We've made the further point that it is not even something that should be striven towards, that we should not try to reach that pinnacle of journalistic objectivity. What we should be trying to do is to lay our ideological persuasion and our cards out on the table and to argue from that perspective. And to reiterate that point and to drive it home, I simply ask you to cogitate on who is the more insidious and effective liar. Someone who comes out and tells you they are coming from a certain point of view and then tells you information based on that point of view, or someone who does not tell you they are coming from a certain point of view and for decade after decade after decade subtly inculcates their worldview into you by pretending to be objective and presenting both sides of the stories, but subtly manipulating every single story through what is covered, how it is covered, and what language is used, and every other detail that is not made absolutely apparent to the reader or listener. It is, I would posit, the latter who is the more insidious liar, and someone who is more capable thereby of manipulating and steering society. So we have to rid ourselves of this idea of journalistic objectivity and understand that we are now moving into a paradigm that is completely different, that we don't have to take the word of journalists for anything, and that we can independently verify and corroborate things for ourselves. We are all necessarily these days, by the ways that we are receiving information, if not our own journalists, at the very least our own editors, and we can go and examine multiple different sources and take that on board, and it is certainly helpful to understand what viewpoint or what ideology each source is coming from to help understand and process the information that is being presented. And we must keep in mind that every single source is itself coming from a very specific point of view, a very certain ideology and a certain worldview that shapes its perception of even what is news and what is not news.